An NPS Arrowhead logo on a black background. Text on screen reads Rebecca Shewmaker, Artist in Residence, June 2024.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Shewmaker.
A woman with short brown hair and glasses, wearing a gray cable knit sweater, sits in her studio next to a sewing machine. On the wall behind her are several scenes of mountains, lakes, and forests on white fabric.
And I had the wonderful experience of being the artist in residence at Glacier National Park in June of 2024. I make what I call thread paintings. You can see examples of my work in progress behind me. From a distance, my work looks like a traditional landscape painting.
A scene fades in of what looks like a textured painting of a green valley with red rock cliffs. Text on screen reads Sunrise Along the Lost Mine Trail, Big Bend National Park Series, 21 inches by 42 inches.
But when you get up close to them, you realize that they're actually made out of fabric.
We zoom in to see a close-up of intricate embroidery work with strands of many different colored threads overlapping in similar directions to create sprays of grasses from the previous image.
And hundreds of different colored threads that I sew primarily with my sewing machine. In June, I got to live inside Glacier National Park.
Pan across a mountainous landscape of Glacier.
I spent most of my time hiking, being inspired by everything I was seeing around me, making art while I was in the park, and then sharing my art with other park visitors. I lived alone in the park, and so I really appreciated that there were several opportunities to go on ranger-led hikes while I was there. In the latter half of June, there was a ranger-led hike almost every day of the week. And so I would go to the National Park website and look at where the hikes were going to be offered. And then I would just meet up with the ranger there. I didn't have to make any reservations. And it was great because the rangers would share lots of information with me about the park. They would point out what plants we were looking at.
Shots of forest scenes. A close-up of pink calypso orchids, an evergreen forest, and yellow glacier lilies.
They pointed out bear trees, which are where the bears like to rub up against a tree and will leave some of their fur behind. I would have missed those had I not been with a ranger. And they also shared a lot of information about the ecology and history of the region. I did start my series while I was in the park, but I definitely got going on it when I got back home into my studio. I use fabric as the base of all of my work. This is a cotton twill fabric that I like to use.
Rebecca holds up a stiff white fabric that looks similar to canvas.
It is a little bit thicker than your typical quilting cotton, and I like it just because my work needs a little bit more support with all the stitching that I use. I will take a piece of fabric like this, I'll pin it into a wooden frame, and then I will take thin acrylic paints and I will paint a very light wash for the sky and for the land. Over here, I have an example of what the work looks like at this point. You can see I've got pink and blue in my sky, and then sort of a purple red for the land.
Rebecca holds up a piece of fabric with very light pink and blues across it, and a darker red in the shape of mountains and a valley.
Once I've done this part of the process, I will take a blue pencil and I will draw out the general shapes of various parts of my composition. You can kind of see that here.
Rebecca holds up another piece with a more detailed scene of mountains, a lake, and the sky in block colors, with more details sketched on top.
This is really important in my process, particularly for a place like Glacier, because the mountains of the area have such distinctive profiles.
Pan across a mountain scene in Glacier, then cut to a thread painting of the same scene.
People who are familiar with Glacier can look at a photograph or a piece of art made from that area and they'll be like, oh yes, I know exactly where that is. I know even probably where you were standing while you were in the park. And so I want my work to be as accurate as possible to reflect what I saw while I was there. Once I've gotten the work to this point, I will start planning out what thread colors I want to use. I have about 1,000 different colors of thread. I keep them right now in bins. So you can kind of see my pink threads here. I keep them in these clear plastic bins, organized roughly by color.
Rebecca holds up a plastic box with dozens of spools of thread in different shades of pink.
And this way I can see all the different thread colors that I have. I also keep them in these bins because my cats, I have 2 cats right now.
Photo of an orange cat lying on a workbench with more boxes of thread than a gray cat stretched out on a gray carpet.
And both of them really like to eat thread, which is not good for them. They should not eat thread. And so this way the thread stays secure inside here and they're less likely to eat it. As I'm working, I will take all of my different bins of thread. I have probably about 12 to 15 bins, and I will lay them out on the floor of my studio. And I'll pick what colors I think I'm going to use in a composition.
Pan across several open bins, each holding dozens of shades of thread in different colors.
I will put those colors of thread in what I call my palette box. So it's a white box, and inside you can see the colors.
Rebecca holds up a white cardboard box with an assortment of spools of thread.
The colors of thread that I have picked for this particular thread painting that I'm working on. This one is kind of messy inside because I am sort of halfway through making this piece. I never pick exactly the right colors in my initial palette decision making. For example, for this piece, I thought I was going to need this sort of blue purple color. It's a very beautiful color. But as I was sewing, I realized it's just a bit too bright in the spot of the composition I wanted to use it. So I had to go back and pick this thread instead. It's a little bit duller, a little bit more gray. And so that happens as I'm sewing. And if I'm having a really busy day of sewing, my thread boxes over here will just get piled with thread. And so at the end of the day, I will have to sit down and sort through them, kind of tidy up a little bit so that I'm ready for the next day. To start stitching, I use an embroidery hoop. It's an 8-inch embroidery hoop like this one. I will put the fabric inside the hoop, and I'll try to make sure that the fabric inside the hoop is nice and tight, and I will start sewing. Here is an example of what the work looks like halfway through.
She holds up a half-finished scene, which has the background painted and a few elements sewn and a circle of fabric pulled taut in an embroidery hoop.
You can tell that my edges of my work are a bit messy. There's lots of little hanging threads. I don't worry about those very much. When I frame them, the edges are covered, so you can't really tell, that the edges are frayed. They're nice and secure on the back of the work. But this is what it looks like when I'm, about 40% of the way through in this piece. So right now I'm working on everything inside this hoop here. You can tell that I've stitched over here. And so I started the piece over here. I took the hoop and I had it originally on this side of the work. I sewed as much as I could in that hoop. And when I was done, I took the hoop off, I took the piece of fabric and I very gently ironed the fabric as flat as possible. And then I moved the hoop over here and rehooped it. And so that's just sort of how I do my work. I do sort of one hoop at a time and go across the composition of the work. When I start sewing, I use primarily a zigzag stitch on my baby lock machine back here. Most sewing machines can do this process. There are a few things you have to do to the machine to tweak it so it'll work. I won't go into the technical details of that right now, but it is very similar to free motion quilting. If I have any people who do free motion quilting listening to this, it's a very similar process. I will put my hoop underneath the foot of my sewing machine, thread my needle, and start stitching.
Close-up of the sewing machine foot working inside the hoop. Rebecca threads the machine, then it cuts to a tree partially sewn in with zigzagging stitches. Then we see the sewing machine in motion, stitching the tree further.
I do change threads fairly frequently as I'm working, and I will often layer different colors on top of each other. For example, I'm working on this tree right here, this sort of cedar tree, and it's composed of a lot of different colors that overlap each other. And so I'll put down one color, kind of cover in most of the tree with one basic color, and then I'll add a darker shade for more depth, and then I'll add lighter shades as well. And so even just an individual thing like a tree can have around 6 to 7 colors in it whenever it's done. For most of my work, I will use the sewing machine for the background and the middle ground of the piece. When I get to the foreground of the piece, which is the part of the landscape that's closest to you, I will start using some thicker threads that I will stitch by hand. Here are several of my different thicker threads that I like to use when I'm hand stitching.
Rebecca holds up another bin with different colored threads.
I keep these in bins as well so that my cats are safe from all the thread. And I have lots of different materials in here. There's a lot of pearl cotton threads. I have some thicker cotton tape and some silk ribbons. I found these really cool velvet covered threads a couple of years ago. I haven't quite figured out what I'm going to do with them yet, but I love the texture so much that I went ahead and bought them. And so the handwork can take an additional amount of time just to add some depth and texture that helps create that sense of illusion of 3D space that I really like in my artwork. My time in Glacier is very special to me.
Pan across several scenes in Glacier. A creek flowing through the forest, a foggy forest scene, the mountainous St. Mary Valley, a still lake with clouds reflecting in the surface, and steep-sided snowy mountains above a lake.
It was marked by a sense of separation and of quiet reflection. Glacier is a fairly remote park to get to, at least for me. It took me about 2.5 days of driving to get to the park. And then where I lived in the park, there wasn't any cell phone coverage. There was very limited internet access. And those things really helped me avoid being distracted by a lot of other things that were happening in the world.
Several of Rebecca's art pieces. Trees in a forest dappled in sunlight, with text on screen reading Trail of the Cedars, Glacier National Park Series, 8 by 8 inches. Sparse trees with glowing sunlight behind, with text on screen reading Rocky Point Trail, Glacier Series, 8 by 8 inches.
And really focus on what I was meant to be doing there, which was taking in as much of Glacier as I could, being inspired, and getting to make work while I was there.
A scene of snowy mountains with a meadow in the foreground, text reading View 1, Iceberg Lake Trail, Glacier National Park Series, 8 by 8 inches.
Glacier is a very special place to many people for innumerable reasons. It's a place that deserves our respect and deserves our efforts to protect and preserve it for future generations.
Text on screen reads, to learn more about Glacier's Artist in Residence program, visit www.nps.gov/glac/getinvolved/air.htm.